Welcome back. Let your shoulders drop. Let the day dissolve into something soft and formless behind you. Tonight we are headed to the Bahamas, an archipelago of low coral and limestone islands scattered across warm, shallow water, and absolutely full of the kind of colonial land grant disputes, salt raking quotas, customs house paperwork, and shipping registry trivia that does nothing for the romance of turquoise water, but everything for the slow, unhurried emptying of your mind before sleep. We will not dwell long on pirates or beach resorts. We are mostly interested tonight in loyalist land surveys, sponge fishing regulations, blockade running manifests, and the long, patient geological accumulation of limestone that built these islands one coral skeleton at a time. There is nothing here that requires your attention. Let it drift past you the way warm, shallow water drifts over a sandbank. We begin. The Bahamas consists of approximately 700 islands, cays, and islets, along with more than 2,000 additional small rock formations scattered across roughly 100,000 square miles of ocean in the western Atlantic, though the total land area of all these islands combined amounts to only around 5,350 square miles, a fact that illustrates just how much of the nation's official territory consists of open water rather than dry land, a ratio of water to land considerably more extreme than almost any other country organized primarily around an island chain. Only about 30 of these islands are permanently inhabited, the remainder being either too small, too dry, or simply too remote from reliable fresh water and transportation access to support permanent settlement, a circumstance that has remained largely unchanged for the entire span of recorded Bahamian history. The practical limitations of small, low-lying coral islands with limited fresh groundwater having shaped settlement patterns since long before any European charts existed to record them. The name Bahamas is generally believed to derive from the Spanish phrase baja mar, meaning shallow sea or low tide, a reference to the extensive shallow banks of submerged limestone, most notably the Great Bahama Bank that surround and connect many of the islands beneath relatively shallow water, creating navigational conditions that proved hazardous to European shipping for centuries and that gave the surrounding waters their distinctive, almost luminescent turquoise color, the shallow depth allowing sunlight to reflect off the pale limestone seafloor in a manner that produces the particular shade of blue-green water for which the islands remain internationally famous, a visual effect that is, in a fairly literal geological sense, simply a function of how much light is bouncing back off a relatively thin layer of seawater sitting atop bright white limestone rather than disappearing into a darker and deeper ocean floor. The islands themselves are composed almost entirely of limestone formed over many thousands of years through the gradual accumulation and compression of coral, shell fragments, and calcified marine sediment, a geological process that has produced a landscape with essentially no significant elevation. The highest point in the entire country, Mount Alvernia on Cat Island, standing at a modest 206 feet above sea level, a height that would not register as particularly notable as a hill in most other parts of the world, but that nonetheless represents the highest natural point across the entirety of the Bahamian archipelago, a fact occasionally noted with a certain wry local humor regarding the rather generous use of the word mount to describe what amounts, in absolute terms, to a fairly modest limestone rise. The earliest known inhabitants of the Bahamas were the Lucayan people, a branch of the broader Taino cultural and linguistic group that also inhabited Cuba, Hispaniola, and other islands of the Greater Antilles, the Lucayans having migrated to and settled the Bahamian Islands sometime around the 11th or 12th century, developing a way of life substantially adapted to the island's particular marine environment, relying significantly on fishing, the cultivation of cassava and other crops suited to the island's thin, rocky soil, and extensive use of dugout canoes for travel and trade between islands and with neighboring island groups further south, a maritime culture whose practical knowledge of the island's currents, shoals, and seasonal weather patterns the Lucayans had developed over several centuries of continuous habitation prior to any European contact. Christopher Columbus made his first landfall in the Americas on a Bahamian island in October of 1492, the specific island in question, which Columbus named San Salvador, having been the subject of considerable subsequent historical and geographical debate, with several different islands within the modern Bahamas having been proposed by various scholars and expeditions over the centuries as the most likely actual landing site, a debate that has never been definitively resolved given the considerable ambiguity and limited detail contained within Columbus's own surviving navigational records, though the island now officially named San Salvador Island has, since the mid-20th century, been generally accepted as the most probable location, a designation formalized substantially through the efforts of a National Geographic Society-sponsored research expedition conducted in the 1980s that attempted, with reasonable though not absolutely conclusive confidence, to reconstruct Columbus's likely course based on the sailing distances and directions recorded in his journal. The Lucayan population, encountered by Columbus and subsequent Spanish expeditions in considerable numbers across the islands, suffered a demographic catastrophe of almost total severity. Within just a few decades of European contact, the Spanish crown having authorized the systematic enslavement and forced removal of the Lucayan population beginning in the early 1500s, primarily to supply labor for gold mining and pearl diving operations in Hispaniola and elsewhere in the Spanish Caribbean, where the Lucayans, who had no prior experience or genetic resistance to the European diseases that arrived alongside Spanish colonizers, alongside the brutal conditions of forced labor itself, perished in such overwhelming numbers that the Bahamas had become, by some point in the 1520s or 30s, entirely depopulated of its original indigenous inhabitants, an extermination so thorough and rapid that the islands subsequently remained essentially uninhabited for well over a century. A sobering historical fact that stands in considerable tension with the island's modern tourism branding around tropical paradise and leisure. The Bahamas remained largely unsettled by any permanent European population for more than a century following this depopulation. The island's lack of any obvious mineral wealth and their generally poor agricultural soil making them considerably less attractive to Spanish colonial interests than the larger islands of the Caribbean and the mainland territories of Mexico and South America, a relative neglect that left the islands available by the mid-17th century. For English settlement, the first permanent English settlement having been established on the island of Eleuthera in 1648 by a group of English religious dissenters known as the Eleutheran Adventurers, who had departed Bermuda seeking greater religious freedom than they had been able to secure there. The settlement's name, Eleuthera, deriving from the Greek word for freedom, a fairly direct reflection of the settlers' founding motivation, though the settlement itself struggled considerably in its early years against poor soil, internal political disputes among the settlers, and the general difficulty of establishing a self-sufficient colonial economy on islands with such limited agricultural potential. Nassau, on the island of New Providence, was established as a permanent settlement in the 1670s and gradually developed into the most significant town in the islands, eventually becoming the capital of the Bahamas, a status it has retained continuously since, the town's name having been given in honor of King William III of England, who held the title of Prince of Orange-Nassau prior to ascending to the English throne, a fairly standard pattern of colonial naming in which numerous settlements throughout the British colonial world received names honoring the reigning monarch's titles or family lineage, rather than reflecting any particular local geographic or cultural feature of the settlement itself. The Bahamas during the late 17th and early 18th centuries developed a reputation as one of the most significant havens for piracy anywhere in the Atlantic world. The island's extensive network of shallow banks, hidden channels, and numerous small cays providing pirate vessels with excellent opportunities to evade pursuit by larger, deeper draft naval vessels that could not safely navigate the same shallow waters, while Nassau's harbor, combined with a notably permissive attitude among several of the colony's appointed governors during this period, who in some documented cases accepted bribes or otherwise actively facilitated pirate activity rather than suppressing it, made the town a genuinely significant operational base for numerous historically notable pirates during what has come to be known as the Golden Age of piracy, spanning roughly the late 1690s through the early 1730s. Edward Teach, more popularly known as Blackbeard, maintained Nassau as one of his significant bases of operation during the height of his piratical career in the early 1700s, alongside numerous other notable pirates of the period, including Charles Vane, Calico Jack Rackham, and the two women pirates Anne Bonny and Mary Red, who sailed with Rackham's crew and who achieved a particular degree of subsequent historical and popular cultural notoriety owing to the genuine rarity of women serving in active combat roles aboard pirate vessels during this period, a rarity that has made Bonny and Reed disproportionately significant figures within popular historical memory and fictional treatment of the golden age of piracy relative to their actual historical prominence among the broader population of pirates operating in Bahamian and wider Caribbean waters during the same era. The British Crown, increasingly concerned about the disruption that the concentration of piracy in the Bahamas posed to legitimate trade and naval shipping throughout the region, dispatched Woodes Rogers, a former privateer captain himself, to serve as the first royal governor of the Bahamas beginning in 1718, with a specific mandate to suppress piracy in the islands, Rogers pursuing this mandate through a combination of military action against pirates who refused to surrender and a royal pardon offered to those willing to renounce piracy and accept a return to legitimate maritime trade or other lawful occupation, an approach that proved substantially successful over the following years in dramatically reducing the scale of piracy operating openly out of Nassau, though Rogers's own tenure as governor was complicated considerably by chronic financial difficulties and disputes with the colony's commercial backers. The Bahamas, having been established at this point as a proprietary colony under the management of a group of investors known as the Lords Proprietors rather than as a direct crown colony, an arrangement that produced recurring friction between Rogers's governance priorities and his financial backers' commercial interests for much of his time in office. The Bahamas' colonial economy throughout the 18th century remained relatively modest and underdeveloped compared to the substantially more profitable sugar-producing colonies of the wider Caribbean, the island's generally thin and rocky soil proving poorly suited to large-scale plantation agriculture of the kind that had made islands including Jamaica and Barbados enormously profitable for British colonial interests, a relative economic marginality that began to shift somewhat following the American Revolutionary War, when a substantial wave of loyalist refugees, white American colonists who had remained loyal to the British Crown during the Revolution and who subsequently faced considerable social and economic pressure within the newly independent United States, relocated to the Bahamas during the early 1780s, many bringing enslaved laborers with them and attempting to establish cotton plantations across several of the larger Bahamian islands, a loyalist settlement wave that roughly doubled the colony's total population within just a few years, and that significantly reshaped the demographic and economic character of several islands, though the cotton plantation economy these loyalist settlers attempted to establish ultimately proved considerably less successful and durable than its founders had initially hoped. The island's thin soil and recurring agricultural pest problems, particularly chenille bug infestations that devastated cotton crops across multiple islands during the early 1800s, contributing to the relatively rapid decline of large-scale Bahamian cotton cultivation within just a few decades of its initial loyalist-driven establishment. The abolition of slavery throughout the British Empire, achieved through the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, with full emancipation taking effect in the Bahamas in 1834 following a transitional apprenticeship period, fundamentally reshaped Bahamian society, the formerly enslaved population, which by this point substantially outnumbered the white population across most of the islands, becoming the demographic majority of free Bahamians going forward, a demographic reality that has continued to define the basic character of Bahamian society and political life through to the present day, the Bahamas having developed in the subsequent decades and centuries following emancipation a predominantly black population whose ancestors' forced arrival in the islands during the plantation era nonetheless came to constitute the clear demographic and eventually political majority of the nation that would achieve independence in the latter half of the 20th century. The American Civil War produced an unexpected economic boom for the Bahamas, the islands, and Nassau in particular, becoming a critically important transshipment point for blockade runners attempting to evade the Union naval blockade of Confederate ports. Ships carrying cotton out of the South would dock at Nassau, where the cotton would be transferred to larger, faster vessels for the transatlantic journey to British textile mills, while manufactured goods, weapons, and other supplies needed by the Confederacy would flow in the reverse direction through the same Nassau transshipment arrangement, a wartime trade so lucrative that it produced a substantial, though ultimately quite temporary, economic boom across the islands, with Nassau's harbor reportedly crowded with blockade-running vessels and the town experiencing a notable, if short-lived, surge in commercial activity and associated speculation, a boom that collapsed rather abruptly with the Confederacy's defeat in 1865, leaving the islands to return to their previous, considerably more modest economic circumstances once the wartime trade opportunity had disappeared along with the conflict that had created it. A remarkably similar pattern repeated itself during the period of American Prohibition, beginning in 1920, the Bahamas once again becoming a significant hub for the illegal smuggling of alcohol into the United States. Nassau and the nearby island of Bimini in particular developing substantial rum-running operations, supplying thirsty American markets throughout the 1920s, a trade significant enough that it produced another notable, if again ultimately temporary, economic boom across the islands before the repeal of Prohibition in 1933 once more removed the underlying economic opportunity that had sustained the boom, a pattern of the Bahamas experiencing periodic windfall economic booms tied to various forms of American legal prohibition or wartime blockade that recurred across nearly a full century of the island's modern economic history. Illustrating a recurring structural feature of the Bahamian economy in which the island's geographic proximity to the United States, combined with a generally permissive local regulatory and enforcement environment to position them advantageously to profit from various periods of American legal restriction on goods that remained, for one reason or another, in continued high demand. The sponge fishing industry developed into one of the most economically significant sectors of the Bahamian economy during the latter half of the 19th century and into the early 20th century, the shallow waters surrounding many of the islands proving exceptionally well suited to the growth of high-quality natural sea sponges, an industry that, at its peak, employed a substantial proportion of the Bahamian working population, particularly across islands, including Andros, and that made the Bahamas, for a period, one of the most significant sponge exporting territories in the world, the industry's prosperity coming to an abrupt and devastating end in the mid-1930s when a fungal blight swept through the sponge beds surrounding the islands, destroying the large majority of the harvestable sponge population within just a few years, and effectively ending the island's position as a major sponge exporter, an industrial collapse from which the Bahamian sponging industry never subsequently recovered to anything approaching its previous economic scale or significance. The development of tourism as the dominant sector of the modern Bahamian economy traces its origins substantially to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when wealthy American and European visitors, drawn particularly by the island's favorable winter climate relative to the considerably colder conditions prevailing in the northeastern United States and much of Europe during the same season, began visiting the Bahamas in increasing numbers, a trend significantly encouraged through the construction of several substantial hotels in Nassau during this period, and the tourism sector's importance to the Bahamian economy expanded enormously across the 20th century, particularly following the introduction of regular commercial air travel connections between the islands and major American cities, a transportation development that dramatically reduced the previous travel time and expense involved in reaching the islands, and that, combined with sustained marketing efforts emphasizing the island's beaches, climate, and proximity to the United States, established tourism as the unquestionably dominant sector of the Bahamian economy by the latter decades of the 20th century, a position the sector has retained with periodic fluctuation tied to broader economic conditions and, more recently, the impact of major hurricanes and the global disruption of the COVID-19 pandemic through to the present day. The Bahamas achieved independence from the United Kingdom on July 10, 1973, becoming a sovereign nation while retaining the British monarch as ceremonial head of state within the Commonwealth framework, a transition to independence achieved through a substantially peaceful constitutional process, rather than through any sustained independence struggle or armed conflict, reflecting a broader pattern common to numerous other small British Caribbean territories that achieved independence during roughly the same general period of the 1960s and 70s, as Britain's broader colonial administration progressively wound down its remaining Caribbean territorial holdings across this period through negotiated transitions to self-governance rather than through any single comprehensive decolonization framework applied uniformly across all the relevant territories simultaneously. The Duke of Windsor, formerly King Edward VIII of the United Kingdom prior to his abdication in 1936 in order to marry the American divorcee Wallis Simpson, served as governor of the Bahamas from 1940 until 1945, a wartime colonial governorship that represented, by most historical accounts, something of a deliberate effort by the British government to place the controversial former king in a position of relative obscurity and limited political consequence, far removed from European affairs during the critical years of the Second World War. The Duke's tenure in Nassau having been complicated by his own documented pre-war sympathies toward Nazi Germany, sympathies that had contributed substantially to British official anxiety regarding his potential political influence or vulnerability to foreign manipulation. Had he remained in a more prominent or geographically proximate position during the conflict, making his appointment to the comparatively remote and politically marginal Bahamian governorship a fairly calculated decision by the wartime British government to neutralize a perceived liability through geographic remoteness, rather than through any genuine assessment of the Duke's particular suitability or interest in Bahamian colonial administration. The murder of Sir Harry Oakes, a wealthy gold mining magnate who had relocated to the Bahamas substantially to take advantage of the colony's favorable tax treatment of personal wealth in July of 1943, remains one of the most notorious unsolved crimes in Bahamian history, Oakes having been found dead in his Nassau home under circumstances suggesting a violent attack. The subsequent murder investigation and trial of Oakes's son-in-law, Alfred de Marigny, who was acquitted by a Bahamian jury despite what many contemporary and subsequent observers regarded as a deeply flawed and possibly compromised official investigation, having generated decades of continued speculation, alternative theories, and amateur and professional investigative interest, including persistent theories implicating organized crime figures. The Duke of Windsor's own wartime administration, given various documented irregularities in how the investigation was initially conducted, and a range of other suspects, none of which has ever been conclusively established to the satisfaction of historians or criminal investigators studying the case in the decades since, leaving the Oakes murder formally unsolved to the present day. The development of offshore banking and financial services within the Bahamian economy, beginning substantially in the mid-20th century and expanding considerably through subsequent decades, established the islands as one of the more significant offshore financial centers within the broader Caribbean region. The Bahamas' combination of political stability, proximity to the United States, and favorable tax and banking secrecy regulations during much of this period attracting substantial international financial activity, a sector that has remained subject to periodic international regulatory pressure and reform efforts, particularly from larger nations and international bodies concerned with the use of offshore financial centers for tax avoidance and other forms of financial activity that those nations and bodies have sought to constrain through various international transparency and information sharing agreements negotiated across the late 20th and early 21st centuries, agreements that have required the Bahamas, along with numerous comparable offshore financial jurisdictions, to substantially modify and increase the transparency of their financial services regulatory frameworks in order to maintain continued access to and good standing within the broader international financial system. The Bahamas' susceptibility to hurricanes, given the island's low elevation and position directly within the principal Atlantic hurricane track, has produced a long history of significant storm damage throughout the island's recorded history, with Hurricane Dorian in September of 2019 representing one of the most catastrophic storms to strike the islands in modern recorded history. The storm stalling directly over Grand Bahama and the Abaco Islands for an extended period with sustained winds reaching Category 5 intensity, producing devastating damage across both island groups and resulting in dozens of confirmed deaths, along with a substantial number of people who remained missing in the disaster's aftermath. A storm whose severity and duration prompted a significant national and international relief and reconstruction effort across the affected islands that continued for several years following the immediate disaster, illustrating the genuinely severe and recurring vulnerability that low-lying island nations within the Atlantic hurricane belt face from increasingly intense storm systems. The Lucayan caverns and broader extensive underwater cave systems found beneath several Bahamian islands particularly Andros and Abaco, represent some of the most significant underwater cave and sinkhole formations known locally as blue holes found anywhere in the world. These formations having developed over many thousands of years through a combination of limestone dissolution processes and the dramatic fluctuations in sea level that occurred across multiple glacial and interglacial periods throughout the broader geological history of the region. The blue hole's distinctive appearance, a deep, dark circular opening surrounded by lighter, shallower surrounding water, having made them both a significant subject of scientific research interest, particularly regarding the unusual and at times still incompletely understood marine and microbial ecosystems found within their typically oxygen-poor, deeper layers, and a notable draw for technical cave diving enthusiasts, a recreational and scientific diving activity that requires specialized training given the genuine hazards involved in navigating these often disorienting and structurally complex underwater cave environments. Dean's Blue Hole, located on Long Island in the Bahamas, holds the distinction of being the deepest known saltwater blue hole in the world, plunging to a depth of approximately 663 feet, a depth that has made the site a globally significant venue for competitive freediving, the sport in which divers descend to substantial depths on a single breath without the assistance of any breathing apparatus. The site having hosted numerous official world record freediving attempts and competitions over the past 2 decades, the Blue Hole's combination of extraordinary depth, calm, and sheltered water conditions, owing to its location close to shore within